looking at the feminist concepts of how we would like to envision work, what I'm going to say in the next 30 minutes is actually not going to allow this to happen. Right, so I'm going to focus really on a bit more of the economic side and some of the ongoing negotiations on agreements related to trade and investment that many of our countries, if not all in this room, have been involved in or are being involved in. So I just want to sort of touch on that, yeah? Because when we talk about human rights, right? Human rights, something that is at the core of the feminist struggle, and one of the most important places at the international level for us to get the principles and the international law and standards to protect our human rights has been in the United Nations. And this forum is looking at one aspect of it, which is, well, not one aspect, the framing of sustainable development, right? Which is very important, and you'll discuss that more tomorrow. And there we see that sustainable development has now got a very strong foundation of human rights. So it is also the same in the United Nations, where we have gone over the decades to get women's rights in CEDAW. We have so many rights on social economic rights. We have rights on civil and political rights, so we can organize ourselves, freedom of expression. We can go to the street in a peaceful way to assert our rights. So these are all very important sets of rights, universal human rights. So these set of rights, and the social economic part of those rights, a lot of it has to do with this, that it is about dignity, it's about the right to work, and all this and decent work, and all this has been developed more and more over the decades until the last few years. And we go to the United Nations precisely where these very important obligations of our countries and governments are also signed. On the other side, you have the hardcore economic agreements, not based on the United Nations principles and values, but one where it is about profit, where human rights become second, third, fourth, not even seen, and corporate rights come to the top. So in that other sphere, the other part of our universe, you see more and more rights of corporations being put into international law. Not through the United Nations, but through treaties, yeah, in other places. Of course, the first place that we all are quite familiar with is the World Trade Organization, right? The World Trade Organization actually was formed after a big number of agreements were signed on trade in goods, in services, adding on intellectual property, which is not free trade, right? Intellectual property is monopoly. A patent over a medicine for 20 years waited for the formal plant breeder who takes farmers' varieties, make a few changes, and then claim intellectual property for another 20 years. You know, plant breeders' rights, or in America, they even get a patent. And then they call the farmers' rights a privilege. So what started as a privilege for corporations has become more and more rights for corporations. And these rights are created mostly in the economic agreements, not inside the United Nations, but outside. So in the WTO, we see the most of them, and then we see more and more coming over the years. Okay. So just some words and concepts I just want to, and many of this came out already in your discussion, all right? I want to start with policy space. Why? Because policy space is the space that we all fight for, to keep within each of our countries, so that our governments, whether it is the parliament, elected, politicians, civil servants, at all levels, from the very local to the central level, that we have the space in our country for us as citizens to determine and shape what kind of vision we have for development, for women, for all of us across the spectrum of gender, right? And that policy space is very important. Of course, we recognize in a world that is living together, because of environmental issues, human rights, in the negotiations of many of the treaties we talk about, you do give up some policy space at the national level to a higher value, let's say human rights, or climate change, where you have to work together across borders. So instead of just looking at your own interest in the country, you look at the community's interest at the international level. So there, you negotiate willingly to give up part of your policy space so that you can have some international cooperation. But you can also have international cooperation and international treaties giving you obligations and responsibilities to a government, to a state, which also will affect us all. But that kind of law, which is positive, like for example, you look at women's rights. We have international rules that we agree on. And then we keep the policy space to implement it. Yeah? So you can give up some space, but you give it up for good. But what happens if you are giving up your policy space for corporations that capture decision making, capture power in your country, own your politicians? And that loss of policy space is very anti-human rights. Okay? So policy space I want to put on top there, because most of what I'm talking about for the rest of this morning is about fighting to keep the policy space. You can have dictators, you can have tyrants as your politicians. You can have generals who are using the army against people. But within democratic space, and even under the most difficult conditions, we can all fight for our own future in our own country. But when you give up a lot of this policy space, when there's no accountability, a corporation that is situated around the world with no loyalty to a country or its people, when they do wrong, where do you go? So this is something that is actually threatened by many of the economic agreements that we see today. Power relations has come out a lot in your discussion. And we all know, as women and LGBT community, we do not need to be told about power relations. Okay? What these agreements do that I'm going to talk about, deepen the inequality. We already are trying to gain some power back, have more equality within our societies. And what we see happening is corporate capture, made legal in many of these new agreements on economics, actually deepen the inequality in power relations. And within the deepening inequality, you're talking about shrinking the space of policy making of the state, all right? Not politicians, but the state is supposed to protect us. And within that, you will see a lot of the marginalization and discrimination against women and LGBTI will deepen. Okay, so it will make it worse. Then it's this issue of liberalization. Here, I'm focusing only on the economic side. Liberalization of the economy in that you open up your national borders, you give up more policy space in terms of regulating what kind of companies will come into your country, what kind of investment. You don't want just any investment, for example. You want investment that will contribute to your country, create decent jobs. Companies that come in will keep the money in the country and not take every cent out of the country. You want to develop your own productive ability in the country. So liberalization of the economy is to be done for the purpose of your development aspirations. But to liberalize the economy, just to open up the borders and all the barriers considered to be barriers by corporations. Corporations just want freedom to move with no accountability, right? Come in when they want, move away when they want, take your money and leave. I sound like I'm making very extreme, exaggerated statements. I don't think I am. Because here I'm not talking about the smaller, medium-sized micro-business. I'm talking about multinational capital here, okay? Because these rules are very much the result of the strong lobby of multinational capital on, unfortunately, the governments, the politicians of the United States, Europe, Japan, and now South Korea. And sometimes even Australia and New Zealand, depending on who gets into power. And Canada even. Canada isn't the nice, lovely Canadian. Canada always talks about, in the area of women's rights, Canada always takes very strong pro-women's rights. But then Canada is the same country which sends out mining companies that destroy women. Yes. Right? So, very sort of two-faced. So liberalization is not just any old liberalization just for corporations, but that's what it is all about. So it doesn't matter how technical and confusing all these agreements are, they're not. They're very simple. All right? It's all about opening up, deregulating, reduce your policy space, allow companies to be unaccountable, and have absolute freedom. It's complete corporate capture, done in a legal way, signed by our own governments. So you will talk more about this because this agenda for sustainable development, with the 17 development goals, don't just look at the goals. The goals are only a small part of a bigger agenda. And this agenda starts from the early 90s, from the Rio Summit on Environment and Development that introduced in the United Nations officially the concept of sustainable development. And from there you had Social Development Summit that looked at structural problems of debt, of trade. Okay, but social protection is only a temporary curing the symptom. Social protection is not enough by itself. You have to have structural change, things that you have identified this morning. Okay? And then you have Beijing Conference, which for the first time was really, really difficult. But we got a set of rights and recognition. And we spent the last 20, 30 years trying to keep the language of Beijing that are not implemented, right? How difficult it is. And then you have more and more financing for the financial crisis, gave rise to financing for development. So within this 2030 agenda, it's a collection of all those obligations and commitments, not just the 17 goals. The 17 goals are only an aspect of it, all right? So do not be reduced to the 17 goals. They are far better far better than the Millennium Development Goals, but it's still not enough. But very important, it talks about transformation, right? Transformation and structural change, systemic change. Recognize that inequality is so deep. If we don't get it right, we're going to be in trouble. Okay? So it's about transformation. And against Band-Aid, standalone social protection, not enough. Okay? So this is the first part I want to talk about. Now, next please. Okay, the types of agreements. Now trade, when we think about trade, we think it's about goods. This is how it started, trading goods, right? But slowly, and the first agreement that actually took it out of goods alone, really was the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, right? Between the US, Mexico, and Canada. That is like the, I won't call it the mother, it's the father of all these nasty agreements. All right, so you find there in the NAFTA a lot of the expansion of trade in goods beyond goods, yeah, into everything in our lives, affects everything. At the same time, we had also WTO, right? WTO was formed to implement, to administer all the different treaties that came together, right? In the late 80s, early 90s, there was a big round of negotiations called the Uruguay round because it was started and ended in Uruguay. It took about 8 or 9 years of negotiations, very difficult. But then all that package of agreements, you could not say, I choose this agreement, not that agreement. Like in the UN, you can choose which one you want to join, which one you don't want to join. And we're always lobbying our governments to join all the UN treaties, right? But in here, this bunch of agreements, it was a package. Take it or leave it. You either join the whole package or you don't join at all. So this forced a lot of governments to accept the whole package of the Uruguay round agreements that went beyond goods. We went into services. Okay, a service is anything you cannot drop physically is a service. Okay, from professional services, any kind of work, planting trees in your urban areas, they're all services. Anything you cannot drop physically is a service. And this is the scope of what they wanted to liberalize, which means open up everything. And then intellectual property, kind of awkward, right? It's a monopoly. What is it doing in free trade? That's why they use the term here called trade-related intellectual property, or trade-related services. Because should you be trading people and labor? Right? So, and then of course some aspects of direct investment, they wanted more. In this round of negotiations, the developed countries, back behind them were all the big corporations, they wanted a full-scale investment agreement. In other words, create rights for investors, a whole range of rights, unbelievable rights. For example, right now in most of our countries, we decide what kind of investment we would like to come into our country. Or some sectors you say no foreign investments, like land. Land is very sensitive. Many countries still do not allow foreigners to own land, for example. Okay? So this is what we call, before you come to the border, I have rights to regulate what I will allow to come in. And how much? Maybe I'll say in this sector, you can come in 10%, 90% must still be domestic ownership. Okay? These are all the different ways you control and regulate for your interests. They wanted one agreement back then that allowed what we call pre-establishment rights. It means before you establish yourself in a country, they say we have rights to come into your country. You have no rights to regulate what kind of investment will come into your country, or put conditions for the investment. They wanted, this is the extreme free investment flow. Of course, there was a lot of resistance from developing countries, right, in the 80s. So they never got an investment agreement. What they did get was a trade-related investment measures. A little agreement. It looks very little, but very dangerous. One of the things that they made very difficult for us to do is in the law today. For example, when you have a foreign investor come in, and it's important for work, you can have a situation where, let's say, you have an automobile industry, a car industry, all right? And you have a policy that says, you come into my country, you invest in a car factory, but 40%, for example, right? 40% of all the parts and bits must come from my country. So I can then allow my local, parts maker and all kinds of different parts of the industry to develop. So this is called local content, right? 40% has to be from the local. Otherwise, everything comes in from outside and I export everything. What is the value for my country, right? The other thing is I could have what we call performance requirements. 40% has to be foreign ownership, yes. 60% must be owned by locals. I can say 50% of the workforce must be local. And out of that, 50% to 60% must be women. You can put these conditions. You can also say, you can come in, I give you tax, some incentive, you have this and this, I give you land for your factory, but you must transfer technology to my local people. So these are what we call performance requirements for an investor to come into a country. These are all conditions. Make sense or not? Do you think this makes sense? Does it make sense if you, yeah?
So this means that there's not one single draft of the bill. They will look different.
Oh, they're all different. Yeah, there are different agreements. So some will be on goods, one will be on services, then on intellectual property, you have different types, within one agreement. So they're all different agreements. There's a whole long list. I haven't put all of them here. But there is no full investment agreement. Right? All the bad things I talked about didn't happen because countries said no. But we did agree in the trade-related investment, one little agreement, that we will give up policy space on local content, right? We narrowed it down, and some performance requirements we also gave up. So we already lost some space.
But all is made by the government.
Of course, nobody knew. Nobody knew. Even the government didn't know everything.
Yes.
When we say government, you go to negotiations. Most of the people who go and negotiate is from the government, don't know what they're doing. I will tell you some stories later.
Yes.
So when we say government, the government did not negotiate. A few people negotiated. And in these negotiations in the 1980s to finish in 1993, there were so many topics, right? So many agreements. Each agreement has so many difficult things. So you have many working groups. And then within the working group, you have 10 pages. This is short. Okay, 10 pages of the draft agreement. Some of you have been to the UN, right? Then you see, oh, this section and this section is so difficult. We cannot agree. Go and form a smaller group. So you can imagine how many parallel groups are going on. Most countries don't even have enough people. And sometimes having a lot of people doesn't mean they know what's happening. Right?
Yeah.
And then they don't know what's happening, they go home, they don't dare to tell the bosses. Or sometimes they know something is not right. Okay? Many of our negotiators know these are very dangerous. But when they go back and tell their bosses, the bosses don't understand and don't want to tell the politicians. And sometimes your prime minister decides, I want to join these agreements. So you don't ask me why, you just go and do your best. And then you have a power relations problem. The United States delegation in trade agreements are always hundreds of lawyers. And then they give special badges to the industry representatives who sit there and write the text. They're always lawyers. Our countries, most of our countries, if we send people who can speak English, we are very happy. Because it's all in English. Unfair power relations. All right? So after these agreements were signed, I remember many of us who were working on this, starting to work on trade, we were all very busy with the UN. I personally was very busy with the Rio process. We were mobilized, the world was mobilized, from indigenous peoples to women to children. We were all so excited. We have a new paradigm of development called sustainable development. Meanwhile, parallel, these fellows were killing us. What killing? I think this thing has dropped. So anyway, so you have a clash, right? You have sustainable development, human rights on one side, and then you have this vampire coming out, which most of us did not know about. Nobody was doing advocacy on trade agreements because we didn't know. Neither did our governments. Right? So, when this was formed to implement all these agreements, it was very powerful because the WTO has a very strong weapon. It's called a dispute system. So if one government says another government didn't follow the rules, you can lodge a complaint. It's a dispute system. It's like a court. And if you are found to violate any of these provisions, you have to change your law. Because all this means you have to go back and change your laws. Some countries have to change the constitution because they didn't know what they were signing until they it sounds funny, but actually it did happen. And then you go to the system. If you lose the case, you can appeal. There's an appellate board. Okay, at least there's a layer you can appeal. And you lose your appeal, then the decision you have to implement. For example, they say you did not comply with something in the intellectual property rules. Your law is not in compliance, right? And you're found guilty. The country, government, has to go back and change. And the government said, I'm not going to change my law. Because if I change my law, my medicines prices will go up, for example. So if you don't do that, then let's say the United States took the case against the Philippines, okay? Or Indonesia, together, took all of you to court. United States say, okay, you don't change your law, I will not buy your goods. It's called cross retaliation. So you punish a country by not buying their imports because they didn't change the intellectual property law. Okay? This is called cross retaliation. Very powerful. That is why our governments will always implement the trade rules because they don't want to be taken to court. Right? Sometimes it's because they don't want to do it, then you have a complaint, but the whole idea is to win them over and make them do it. Sometimes they just need help to do it. Okay? That's the kind of different approach. This one is money, 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 money. You don't, I punish, I fine, you know? So, yeah? So it's multilateral means almost all countries. United Nations is multilateral. This one, because now I think almost all the countries in the world, except a few, are not members. So we call this a multilateral trade system. Okay? But it's not really trade, because it deals with so many things. So the word trade is sometimes very misleading. Right? Then we have what we call plurilateral. This is an agreement where not everybody agrees they want it, right? But some people want to have it. So they come together and they have an agreement. An example in the WTO, see WTO, the big companies and their governments are always trying to put more and more agreements inside here because of the enforcement machine. Okay? So one of the things which is very, very sensitive, which has never gotten support here 100%, is government procurement. Government procurement is a very important tool for our governments to, most money is actually spent in government procurement, right? This is money you spend on building roads and schools and bridges and roads, all the spending you do from your pencil to your drinks to your food. So most countries, even in the United States, you want your local companies to be the ones to get the contracts. This is how you use taxpayers' money to build your local industry, to create employment, etc. Okay? So government procurement is normally kept for local companies. And in countries like Malaysia, we use government procurement to also bring up our affirmative action, our Bumiputera policy. Okay? So, the big companies, they look at it very jealously because they cannot get it. Because most countries will keep most of this, or up to 60-70%, if not all, high percentage will be kept for local companies. And this is something that multinationals always want to get. Okay? So there was no agreement to get a full-scale agreement for everybody to join, so they have a plurilateral. And here is also limited, it's only on transparency. In other words, you have to, when you do procurement, you have to give all your rules transparently. If you don't give, it also can be a bit of a problem. It means that if I don't give to a foreign company, the foreign company can ask me why you didn't give it to me. So sometimes we all want transparency for accountability. But transparency in the agreements around trade and investment and economics is about transparency for the multinational corporation. Yeah, so they want all kinds of information for them to monitor our governments. Okay? So be careful when we fight for transparency, they mean a different thing from us. Okay? Then there's this thing called regional agreements within your geographical region. So you have ASEAN, for example, yeah? And then the one that I'll talk on a little bit afterwards is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is being negotiated at the moment. Because they realize the word trade, everybody's been complaining, this is not really trade. So now they call it economic partnership. Partnership sounds very good. But again, if you have unequal power relations, is it a partnership? No. It all sounds nicer, economic partnership. Okay, so we have this regional economic partnership. Then the last category of agreements will be bilateral, it's between two countries. All right. For example, in our region here in Asia, US has an agreement with Singapore, which opens up a lot, everything practically. Okay. And it's a problem for ASEAN because Singapore then uses this standard to make the rest of ASEAN countries go that way. Right. So anybody from Singapore here? No? Yeah. This is why we have no Singapore people here. Singapore is we need to help Singapore. And then we have what we call bilateral investment agreements. This is only dealing with investment. There are thousands of them. All right? And there's some old ones are very simple, they're very straightforward. The new ones are all very nasty. Okay? And all these agreements now, all right, this one, remember, they didn't get a full scale, 100% investment agreement. But in all these new agreements since then, there is a chapter on investment. So all the things they cannot get here, they go and get it here. This is why in the last 10, 15 years, there has been an explosion of all these agreements. What you can't get here, you go there. And once you get enough countries to agree to those horrible things, you come back here. And then they won't say no anymore, because they've all agreed here. So the move is then to come back here and have a multilateral agreement. Okay? With enforcement. Okay, next. Okay, so far, any questions? You following me? Okay, just very quickly. You know there's many of you who are in the UN, you go to attend the UN. Okay, I just want to quickly, so that the words are clearer later on. So when you want to make a treaty, there is another UN convention on the law of treaties. This one tells you the steps and the procedure for making a treaty, right? So we all do it properly. So first you have negotiations. Before you start a negotiation, you must come together and agree that you want to do a negotiation. So you want to decide, do I want to do it for what issues, what scope, what mandate, what principles? You negotiate that first so that you are on the same page. Again, even here, back to power relations. You have unequal players. Then you find, for example, many of us will say, I just want to have an agreement on goods. I want to export more to you. I can import some from you. Let's have an agreement on goods. The other fellow say no, because I want my banks and my companies want to come into your country. So they want to have a bigger scope. So even negotiating the scope depends on your power. And many times, as I said just now, our Prime Minister and President wants to do it. So even though it's really bad for your country, you end up inside there. Okay? And I don't blame the civil servants because there's really nothing much they can do sometimes. Okay, they negotiate, it can be many, many, many years. Conclude, you give and take and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes you get murdered, slaughtered, you know, very, very painful, many of these agreements. Then you conclude. And every country has a right to make reservation. Even though you are forced to get to that compromise, you can still say, I reserve, I don't agree with this one, that one, that one. You can do it. But very few countries in trade agreements do that, because they feel so shy, or they get pressure not to do it, or they don't know they can do it. Okay? So they don't make enough reservations. Of course, you can also have different lists where for your country, you know, it depends on how good a negotiator you are and how clear you are about the impact on your country. So you will fight for it. But this is all just, I think, a little bit of safeguard. If the fundamental thing is bad, you are in trouble. Then you sign, okay? You finish, then you have a signature. The reason I want to raise this is because when you sign, it doesn't mean that that treaty legally binds your country. It's the second step that must be taken legally. It's called ratification. You have to ratify. It's a letter you send to the Secretariat, whether it's the UN or if it's like the Trans-Pacific Agreement is New Zealand, that is the Secretariat. So you send a letter from your government saying, I am going to ratify. The signing is a ceremony. All the ministers will go and they sign. But this process sometimes takes longer because you need to go home, You discuss with people, and then from between here and here, the treaty is now public document. Before this, nobody can see the treaty. In the UN, we have all the drafts, right? You go to the United Nations, all the drafts are there. It's very transparent. Trade agreements, no. Okay? So it's only between here and here that the documents become public. Then you have a lot of fights. But a lot of documents are now getting leaked, right? People are leaking. Sometimes the negotiators leak them because they're very worried. You know, sometimes even negotiators from developed countries will leak it. So when they leak it, they put on WikiLeaks. And then we all can analyze. And then we can make noise. Okay. So you have to do this. Then only you become legally bound, right? And you have to start changing your laws. In many countries, they will also sometimes change all their laws first before they ratify, right? And think about it. The more complicated your treaty is, the more laws you have to change, right? Then entry into force. It doesn't mean that you ratify immediately, you're bound. Because every treaty will have different rules. Sometimes it says if there are 12 countries, they say if 6 countries ratify, the treaty comes into force. Okay? So it starts moving, the machine moves. But for the country, until you ratify, it doesn't apply to you yet. Okay? Now this I put here so that you keep notes. If any of you become a negotiator or go into your delegation for your government, keep notes. Who said what? Why? Because in a case of a dispute, because you know when you negotiate, you always have some language is not so clear. You're also compromising. Okay? So if there's a dispute, I have one interpretation, you have one interpretation. I say I didn't do anything wrong, you say I did very wrong. So the notes become important. What was the understanding to help the interpretation? Or sometimes your negotiator from your government may have said, okay, I agree that for me, this is the meaning. Could be bad for you, right? Your official didn't keep notes. The other side kept the notes. So in a dispute, they will come out and say, hey, your negotiator agreed that this word means this. Then you're in trouble. Okay? Because in the disputes we have seen in the WTO and other places, the developed countries always have negotiation notes in the file. Most of our countries in the developing world, nobody keeps files. You get the file, didn't get to the next person, because civil servants move. And sometimes some people don't take notes. Okay? Very important. All right, next. I want to bring this up because a lot of you here are talking about work. You're working with workers, and we want to have security of jobs. Okay? I just want to show you one example. This is the World Trade Organization, one of the agreements, trade in services. In this agreement, they recognize there are 4 ways services are provided. Yeah? Now, don't forget, all these agreements are designed to open up, to liberalize. So in every one of these agreements, the country agrees that it will open up. Okay? So you agree already what you're going to open up, which sector, by how much. Each country will have a schedule already. Each of your countries have a schedule for services liberalization. And some agreements will say, we continue to liberalize, every 5 years we'll meet or something like that, depending on the agreement. So there are 4 areas, 4 ways you can have services. The first one is, remember, it doesn't matter what it's called, it's all about don't control the foreign company. Okay? Don't control them coming in, don't control what they do, and don't control them taking the money out. Simple as that. I mean, of course there are exceptions and safeguards, yeah? But that's basically it. This one is something that we're all most interested in. They recognize in all these agreements, and this same 4 ways is repeated in all the economic trade agreements that we see. This is presence of natural persons, individuals traveling from their own country to supply services in another country. Domestic workers, construction workers, nurses, consultants, etc., etc., etc. Or the professionals of the companies, people who work in the companies, the managers and things like that, right? So you're supposed to have also freedom of movement of companies and services and freedom of movement of people. This is the most difficult. This is the one of most interest to developing countries because we have a lot of labor, maybe talented, sometimes forced to leave the country, right? I mean, I don't think domestic workers want to be domestic workers overseas. If they can have jobs at home, that's where we'd rather be, okay? But nevertheless, if you have to have that, this is where you're supposed to open up and give protection and all the things that you will do when people are in your country as a foreign worker. This is the one that is the most not liberalized by developed countries. Okay? So even if you're a nurse, for example, in the Philippines, you're qualified, you're very experienced. You try to go to a developed country, they say, yeah, Mode 4, we all agree we sign up to Mode 4, natural persons can come in, but they will require, like in Japan, they require that you speak Japanese. Like how many of us will, unless you've taken the courses, right? Or they will have other additional requirements, making it hard. So you can have movement of people, but they can put in a lot of other technical requirements that does not allow you to come in. Then we call that discrimination, right? But so I wanted to raise this because services is one of the areas that affect most of us here. Okay, corporate rights, not human rights. Some examples. Look out for these, okay? Sorry, but I'm spelling them all out, right? Okay, the first one, I think many of you are quite familiar with this, I think, right? We have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. This one started in 2010, right? It finished around 2016, 17, and then of course we know the famous story of the United States walking out, right? These are the countries, the Trans-Pacific, right? Australia, Brunei, etc. The ones in dark and bold colors are the same countries that are also now negotiating the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Most of us here are affected, yeah? This agreement was very much led by the United States. They wanted, you see China is not here, yeah? Because the US was concerned that as China was growing, China was entering into a lot of trade relations with Southeast Asia and some of the Latin American countries. So this was really designed for the US to keep their dominance in the Trans-Pacific region. So China was not allowed to come in. And China wanted to come in. They said, oh, we don't want to be left out. This is like the biggest group of countries. And then they started looking into what the chapters actually involve, and then the Chinese said, maybe we don't want to come in here. Because there's a chapter on state-owned enterprises, which means you privatize a lot of state-owned enterprises. Big privatization is involved in this, right? And all kinds of new things that you don't have in WTO, that we didn't think about before. E-commerce. E-commerce is not about buying on Amazon. Not only that, it's about source code. You know, recently the Boeing plane that crashed, right? All the software around all the different parts of a plane. In these new agreements, the companies claim that all the information about the source code of the software is private property that belongs to them. And governments don't have the right to have access. And for many of these things, government needs this for enforcement and regulation. Right? Or for example, when you do a bank transfer, you get a password on your phone, right? And then you have to put the password, the code into the internet banking. Okay? Our central banks are the ones who are regulating. So like in Malaysia, our central bank will say, if you want to do online transactions, you have to do this, do this, do this. Security. So the government sets the standards. In the TPP and CPTPP, they do not want governments to regulate. They say we, the banks, will set our own standards on safety and security. They don't want to be regulated. So whether it is secure enough, good enough for the billions of dollars that go on internet banking, ordinary people, we don't know. They don't want government to oversee them. This is just an example. So e-commerce, many of our governments think it's about, buying and selling things on internet. It's not. There are many, many things like that which are very problematic. And it's all in that. And very few people understand what it is. Okay? So we had this one, and then the United States walked out because Mr. Trump says this is a very bad agreement for the United States. Most of these agreement provisions here were because of the United States. They were demanding very extra intellectual property. They would have made medicines. So that's why in many countries, like in Malaysia and the Philippines and others, even in the developed countries, the ministries of health were very, very anti the intellectual property chapter, because it would have made more monopoly over medicines, would have really made medicines more expensive. So very controversial. A lot of public, there was a lot of campaigning in many countries, including Malaysia. So, but Mr. Trump said, it's very bad. It's a very unequal treaty. for America. Why? Because Mr. Trump is actually correct. He wants to boost American industry. He wants to boost American jobs. And say these will open up all these doors, and then all the American companies will go to these other countries. Because American companies don't care about America. They just want to make money wherever they can, right? So Mr. Trump is actually not too wrong. So when he left, we were all very happy, right? Phew, okay, the United States have gone away, we're going to be left alone, we'll be safe. And even the Japanese Prime Minister Abe, he said, without the United States, the TPP is meaningless. Because we agreed to a lot of new things. We agreed to open up government procurement to foreign companies, and then even we have safeguard. After 8 years, you have to reduce. Really terrible. Okay, 1,000 provisions, huh? 1,000 provisions. Annexes, footnotes, you know? More than 1,000 provisions. So, we agreed to all those things because we could export a little bit more to the United States. Okay? So without the United States, why bother? So we had about 1 year of rest. And then suddenly, New Zealand, Japan, they want it. So they say, we can, because I have no idea why. Right? I mean, maybe they feel that they took so many years, spent so much money and time, they don't want to admit that it's all because of, without America, it's going to collapse. So we can do it without America. But we suspect there's a lot of corporate lobby. Because even if the American government is not a party, American companies can still benefit. Because these companies are in all these countries. They have, maybe have subsidiaries, they have branches, they have a lot of interest. So if you have a presence of your company in any one of these countries, you can make use of this agreement for that company. All right? Remember this Philip Morris suing governments for plain packaging of cigarettes? Anybody heard of this? Yeah? Because Philip Morris, because of smoking is so bad for you, obviously, and then WHO has a very big treaty on tobacco control. One of the things you can do under the treaty is to regulate advertising. So Uruguay, Canada, and Australia decided we will not allow cigarette companies to put their brand, plain packaging. Okay? So Philip Morris sued them all under investment agreements. All right? So because Philip Morris has branches, subsidiaries in Hong Kong, in different places, so they sued Australia under one agreement, they sued Uruguay under another agreement in Switzerland, and then they sue, you know, same company, corporate rights. You and I as human beings, we only have rights where our citizenship is recognized in the country. And even then, sometimes those rights are not recognized, right? But these companies have multiple rights because they are citizens all over the world, wherever they have a presence. So they can invoke those governments to go and do things for them. Or agreements those governments have signed, they can use to go and sue other governments. So Canada got scared, so they stopped. They actually withdrew their plan. Australia and Uruguay continued. And then they were taken to tribunals, right? Things like that. So, because of this, the United States going, but then New Zealand and then Japan turned around and said we want it. So they said, okay, the 11 of us, minus the United States, we will continue. Then they gave themselves a new name, comprehensive and progressive. Because there was so much protest. They said we will have a new agreement. So a lot of people think it's a new agreement. Because now it's comprehensive, as if it wasn't comprehensive. But it's not comprehensive from our point of view, right? And progressive. Without the US. What is so different about this? There's a few pages they negotiated, and then Canada put in a very beautiful paragraph. We love gender, we love the environment, we love sustainability, blah, 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 blah. But the whole thing incorporates the 1,000 provisions. All of you here are here, right? Okay? Together with India and China. Then Indonesia cleverly said, we're not going to join this right back. Okay? But Indonesia is here. China is actually, people say this is China-led. No. A lot of Westerners, especially Americans, say, if we leave this, China will take over the region. This is actually very mixed. If you look at the leaked text, you can see which countries have what position. China sometimes is with the developing countries of the region, sometimes they have their own interests, but they are not the lead. Some of the worst proposals in this agreement is coming from New Zealand, Japan, Korea. Korea is not here, Korea is here. Okay? But Korea has a free trade agreement with the United States, which is very bad. I mean, bad from our point of view. So Korea will put proposals here, which is like the ones in the Korea-US agreement. Then you have Japan and New Zealand and Australia will put other things from here and put here. So what this has the danger of becoming is this thing, which went through this thing, comes inside here. And some things are a bit better than here, maybe two, but many things are worse than here. Brought in by Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. Okay? So it's not a China-led agreement. Now here we have for the first time.
Sorry, I just saw my recording later. When you say here, can you just say TPPs?
Okay, sorry.
No, that means also there's so many.
I cannot remember so many things. Okay, sorry. But for the first time in the regional, in RCEP, we have Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia. Now these are least developed countries in the United Nations. Least developed countries are the ones who are starting to industrialize. Among the poorest in economic terms, not necessarily in other ways, but given special rights, right?
One question. Why Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan, Afghanistan is not there?
Lucky for you. Lucky for you. Because this,
But our government is following all the.
your government is feeling left out. You see, everybody feels left out. So they want to join. Not realize this, you don't want to join these clubs. They're very bad for you, you know. So this is because this RCEP was the initiative of ASEAN countries, right? Because ASEAN have signed among themselves a trade in goods agreement and then some other cooperation, not these comprehensive things, because we couldn't agree. Because we're all very different levels. Because within ASEAN, Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar have said no to some of these crazy things within ASEAN, and they're correct to say that, okay? Because we are different. See, you don't have equal power relationships. You cannot have one treaty that fits everybody's size. You cannot. You must have differentiated, equitable treatment, right? So all those principles in the UN are not here. So then ASEAN said, we want to consolidate, right? ASEAN as a group has signed agreements with China and with India on trade. That's why Bangladesh and all that are not India. Because there are some individual countries in ASEAN we've got, agreements with Pakistan or Bangladesh on the power. But like I said, be happy you're not in here. But your governments are following the same thing anyway.
I'm telling that.
At least you do it unilaterally. Oh, I forgot that one. Yeah, you do it unilaterally, you can still go backwards. Liberalization can be done by a country by itself. But you say, oh, mistake. Or I open for imports. Too much imports coming in is killing my local producers. You can put a tax again. You can have flexibility. You have policy space. But once you lock inside here, you cannot, no returning backwards. Yeah? So here we have Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, which are accepting some of the highest standards of liberalization of countries like the United States set up here. Why? It's very dangerous. For me, I am most worried about Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. So we have to think what to do. Thailand is in here. But Thailand wants to join this one. Cambodia also wants to join this one. And Japan is encouraging these countries to join this one. Because this one is actually not moving so fast. Right? Okay, next. Okay, this is a CPTPP, just to give the comprehensive and progressive TPP. So at the moment, we have, it was signed in 2018. It's in force. Right now, only 3 countries have not ratified legally, taken the last step, yeah? That's Brunei, Malaysia, and Peru. Malaysia, we are having a big fight because we have a new government, as many of you always hear from us. When the new government, the politicians today who are government, when they were all in the opposition, we had a big campaign in this country on TPP, the first agreement. Every one of our members of opposition said no to the TPP. Bad, no, bad, no. Today they're all in government. Most of them don't know anything about these agreements, right? Some of them are pushing for ratification. Some understand it's bad and say we should not ratify. Civil society groups are saying don't ratify. So the Prime Minister is going to make a decision very soon. And he has asked for studies to be done to really look at this 1,000 pages. Okay? So we hope that Malaysia will not ratify. I'm going to tell our government, because people say, oh, everybody has ratified. If you don't ratify, Vietnam will take over Malaysia. That's what some of our politicians who want to ratify keep saying, Vietnam will take over Malaysia. I was in Hanoi last year when the Vietnam government submitted the CPTPP to the Vietnam Parliament or Congress, right? And nobody has done an assessment. Not really, right? And some of the parliamentarians were very concerned. They raised many concerns like what we have analyzed. And my colleague who works on all these issues has been, giving some research to the Vietnam negotiator. Some of your negotiators are very good. They're very good negotiators. But your country is the example where the people negotiating know it's dangerous, but they can't get the message up to the top. But it's a political thing because the speech in Parliament was, joining the CPTPP will show the world that Vietnam continues to do economic reform towards the market economy. And what I found very worrying was at the end of it was, once we have joined, it shows then we will do better, more investments will come, all those things which basically have no intellectual basis, okay? No evidence, all these kind of rules will give you more good investment and more, more happiness. Actually, I'm not making you happy, so I failed to make people more happy. So far, but don't worry, we have to fight back. So basically, now the government then says in Vietnam, now that we have joined, let's do an assessment. Let's look at how all the laws will be affected in Vietnam. So you're kind of a bit in trouble. Yeah. But I think if more countries speak out, we may still have a chance, right? So we're telling Malaysia, even if you are the last country, our government, we're telling them, even if you're the last country that won't join this, don't do it. But luckily, recently, we joined the International Criminal Justice Court's Statute of Rome. After we ratified, then there was a big, horrible objection from some people. So the government was forced to turn around and walk away. So we told the government, if you can walk away from the International Court of Criminal Court Treaty, you can walk away from this one. This is even more dangerous. It's really dangerous. This will unravel practically all our policies in this country because we've done a very detailed analysis. Like I say, Thailand wants to join because the military government thinks that joining this will bring it back to the international community. So I think there's going to be some workshops starting in Thailand to do some analysis on this. It's kind of hard. CSOs cannot, yeah. So we have to find ways of doing it, yeah. So Japan is encouraging, yeah. Now, when you join this agreement, you have to change measures. There's a word called measures in the agreement that you have to change to make all your measures comply with this agreement. What are measures? There's a definition of measures. It includes your laws, your regulations, your guidelines, your directives, your internal government circulars, your policies, everything to do with your decision making. All the things that we want to be influencing, these agreements of corporate capture are shaping. So even if you have good laws and protection in your country, some of them may have to be changed. Not everything, okay? Not everything will be changed. But even then you're not safe, and I'll show you why. More bad news, sorry. Next one. Okay, so this is ongoing. This is not finished, right? So I would encourage us to think about how the groups here and outside and more groups have to get involved in discussions at the national level because it is not finished, all right? This one is not finished. And many of the chapters are really only proposals. There are no agreements, okay? So we are not late to work on this. It started in 2012. It's 7 years already, yeah? So every year they say we'll complete at the end of this year, but it never finishes. Now they say we'll complete at the end of this year, but I don't think it's going to happen. And the more there are protests in different countries, and countries are also finding it very problematic, yeah? Okay, so this is what I've already just said. Yeah, next one. Look at the negotiation meetings. Okay, started in 2013. 2012 was when they launched, and then they had the ceremony and photographs. The first official round was in 2013. Then they meet, right? Here, 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 here. These are the rounds. Every time they meet, it's called a round. And then sometimes on top of the rounds, which is a technical civil servant negotiations, they have the ministers come together.
Why do ministers come together? They bring ministers when they say, all these technical people, because our civil servants are not all bad and stupid, all right? Some of them are really working very hard. They know this is very dangerous. So they cannot agree on things. They're fighting. So then they say, bring the ministers, because now we need a political decision. The ministers will decide, because these civil servants can't decide. So we take it to the level. So it's called political level, okay? And in those political ministerial meetings, no technical, maybe one technical person can go in with the minister. Remember, these agreements have 20-something chapters on every topic under the sun. So they will pick one. Okay, we cannot agree on this particular aspect. Let's go to the ministers. Very dangerous, huh? Very dangerous. Because sometimes the ministers really don't know anything. Sometimes there are new ministers who really don't know what RCEP is, okay? All right? And sometimes they know, but they don't know how to argue. And then it's very dangerous. And then the ministers of the developed countries are very well prepared, right? So unfair power relations. Then go back again, Myanmar is hosting here. And by the way, you have to spend money when you're hosting all this. A lot of taxpayers' money goes to all this. You're paying your negotiators to fly all over the region. You have to pay when you host it, you know. Then we go, top, 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 top. Okay, next one. This is 2016, and then we have some more, okay? Okay, so the next one is in May. It's going to be, so the last one was in, we had one in Bali. I think Bali is missing here. Oh, there's one more here. This is Bali, sorry. Forgive me, my friends from Indonesia. Maaf. Actually, this is Bali, okay, in February. And then in May, it'll be in Singapore. Now, in every one of these places, except for China, when China hosts, when Singapore hosts, there's not much civil society activity. But in all the other countries, there's a lot of civil society activism, you know, people's forum, protests, and all that kind of thing going on. Okay, so there'll be more. Okay, next. This is at the moment the chapters in the RCEP. All right, these are the different chapters. Look at all the different things. This affects a lot of our lives. Yeah. The ones in dark are supposed to have been agreed. The one in italics, leaked text. We got the leak, so we could see what they were and sort of make noise a little bit. Some of them don't have anything yet. Like for example, e-commerce is just a title. It doesn't have any content yet, but we expect that they will take the TPP, CTPPP chapter and bring it here. Okay, so this is the chapter. Government procurement is in here, but only transparency. In the TPP, is government procurement also opening up your tender and your contracts. So you open up a lot more in the CPTPP. Here is only you offer transparency of information. But like I said, transparency also means you are now going to be examined, not by you and me, the government is going to be examined by the multinational companies. Financial services, you open up also. Okay, don't control banks, don't control. And one of the most dangerous things here is capital controls. Financial crisis, you want to control money going in and out of your country. They reduce the policy space of what you can and cannot do. Okay, all right, next. Okay, a lot of workers, especially unions, during the TPP time, right? The TPP and the CPTPP is there. There is a chapter on labor. Now you don't see in the RCEP. So a lot of unions at that time said, because in the US also the labor unions were very, very strong against TPP. So they say, okay, the government said, we will put in a labor chapter. So of course developing countries say, oh, no, right? Americans say, we champion labor. So let's have a labor chapter. What is a labor chapter? Okay. Now within these agreements, they also have enforcement. Yeah, they have an enforcement, not like WTO, you don't go to WTO, but they create an enforcement mechanism inside this treaty that is like the WTO. So it's very strong enforcement also, right? So weak that it's almost useless to help you to defend violations, to protest against violations. They don't deal with worker representatives. See, all these treaties create a right for investors to sue the government. Okay, I think you've heard about this, investors suing the government. Normally in all the intergovernmental government-to-government agreements, government complains against government, like in the WTO, in the UN. But these agreements give the power to the foreign investor to sue a government for not protecting their rights. So they have direct rights, but not your workers. There's nothing to termination of employment, compensation, all these things that we talk about doesn't deal with it here. And this chapter is not enforceable. In other words, if you violate this, you don't go and complain. You can complain on a G to G, but you cannot take a direct case. But the company can take a direct case if it thinks the labor law is making its profits go down. All right, if a good labor law results in the company making less money, they can sue your government for that labor law. But if the labor law violates our rights, we cannot, under this agreement, enforce that right. Because the right of the investor is the foreign investor. It's not your local investor. So the foreign investor to sue your government. Okay, next.
We cannot move, we cannot survive.
Don't sign, don't ratify, don't join. The obligations, there's some obligations, but they're very general, very vague, not very clear. Like I said, you can complain through the system of the treaty, of the agreement, state to state, okay? You can do state to state. So if you're violated, let's say you are working in Malaysia. Malaysia has signed the treaty, and then your rights are not protected. You can complain to your government if they are all, members of this treaty. You can complain, let's say in the Philippines Philippines not here. Let's say you can complain in Vietnam to say that the Vietnamese worker in Malaysia is not being protected, right? But then you will have to get your government in Vietnam to take some complaint against the Malaysian government. So you have to go back to the state, okay? But you have no direct complaints rights. You must go through your government.
Yeah, we do to our government and government.
The government, if your government decides to do something, then they will come and do something to the Malaysian government and put a complaint. But if it's a foreign investor of Vietnam, let's say in Malaysia, and the Vietnam company says, my rights have been violated, my company rights, then the Vietnam company can directly sue the Malaysian government in the tribunal. Okay? And you can sue for loss of profits, including future profits, expected profits. You haven't made any money yet, but you can calculate, I was going to make this amount of money if you hadn't passed this law. So you can also sue. So you see a lot of these dispute cases is hundreds and hundreds of millions that they claim against governments. And then,
What is the tribunal? What is
I'm coming to that, yeah. So then, and even if you want to take some complaint, all right, G to G, you the worker, say I'm the violated worker, I have a complaint, I must demonstrate, that, so let's say Vietnam government is trying to protect the Vietnamese worker who is in Malaysia. The Vietnam government must demonstrate that the Malaysian government has failed to adopt or maintain or to implement one of our laws, and sure, Malaysia didn't do what they're supposed to do for labor protection, but not enough. But it must be a violation by the Malaysian government in a manner affecting trade or investment between the parties. This means just because your rights are violated in Malaysia, the Vietnamese government cannot just complain. They must show that your rights are violated, and it must be violated in a manner that affects trade and investment between Vietnam and Malaysia. So it's not really protecting labor. Okay? It's not. It's only when it affects trade and investment, that means the company is affected. So this chapter is no comfort. In fact, very dangerous, because a lot of unions, some unions thought, with this chapter is a safeguard, then we can accept the whole TPP. But first of all, this chapter is rubbish, frankly, all right? And all the other chapters, if you implement them, you will not even have a job. A lot of employment will be actually, you close down small business style, you cannot compete against the big companies coming into your country, for example. So you will actually lose jobs rather than, so this is not enough, okay? So don't be fooled by anybody telling you, it's okay, have a chapter on labor, have a chapter on environment. And environment is always like, there's one in TPP as well. We will try to do something together, and also not enforceable, okay? Except to state. And then now in WTO, they talk about gender. Some of the new agreements will have a chapter on gender. A chapter on gender. Systemic power relations we're talking about. If the whole agreement is structurally anti-human rights, how can a chapter solve the problem? Okay? Next, please. Right. Why is it so dangerous? I'm now going to focus on the investment chapter, as well as bilateral investment agreements that have the same powers given to companies. Yeah. First of all, what is an investment? In the old days, an investment means you come to my country, you build a factory, you build something concrete, you create jobs or whatever. These agreements, the investment agreements, as well as the investment chapter in the economic agreements, say investment includes shares, the debt of a company, contractual rights, whatever contracts they have signed, permits, intellectual property, licenses, expectation of profits. All these things are called investment. So if you do anything, if your government does anything that affects any of these things, you have actually reduced the value of the investment of the company. This is very broad, okay? Remember this definition when I go to the next slide. It is very broad, okay? So the investment state dispute settlement, and I will say ISDS, all right, ISDS, investor state dispute settlement, is the right, as I said, given to the foreign investor to sue a host government over anything that affects an investment as broadly defined here. And here it says includes. If you're a lawyer, includes means this list is not complete. There could be many things that I can argue is an investment. And if I succeed in arguing for it, you are also responsible. Okay? Includes. Next. Okay. All right. So the most common ground, you see all these investor state dispute cases, the most common ground that they use to sue governments is what we call, you have failed, the government has failed to give me minimum standard of treatment, or you did not give me fair and equitable treatment. Sounds nice, right? Sounds logical. Why should we not treat people fairly and equitably? But this is not about you and me. It's not about minimum standards of human rights. It's minimum standard of treatment of the company and fair and equitable for the company. And what this all means is the worst meaning. Okay, many of the cases show you what they mean by fair and equitable and all that is you change your law. When you signed the agreement, your law was like this. When I came into investment to invest in your country, your law was like this. But how dare you, after I've come in, you change your law? Or I haven't built my factory yet. I expect to make money, and you change your law, or your regulation, or your guidelines, all right? Then I will sue you, because you affect my investment.
Oh my God.
All right? Okay. There's some safeguards in the CPTPP, but not enough. RCEP, they are still fighting over this chapter, so we don't have any safeguards, because they're still fighting, okay? All right, next. Very quickly, I'll give you 1 or 2 cases. Now, what are they saying you do? When you do a law or do a policy to protect, let's say, workers or women or whatever, okay? And you affect the investment, they say, the companies, this is expropriation. It means you're taking away from me, okay? Expropriation can be 2 types. One is direct. Government comes and takes over a factory. They take our land to build a road. They have to pay us compensation, right? That's expropriation. There is something called indirect expropriation. And one aspect of indirect expropriation is what we call regulatory takings. You pass a regulation to take away my rights. Not yours and my rights, but regulatory takings of a company's interest. So changes of laws and all that is what they call indirect expropriation. All right, next one. I'll give you quickly. Okay, applies to all these things, yeah, what we talked about. And also subnational. So in Indonesia, you got provinces, central government. In Malaysia, we got state, we got federal. Applies to federal and sub-federal. Indonesia is a very famous case. There was one province that issued a license for mining, and it was illegal according to the central government's law. The government came in and said that is illegal. It's illegal under Indonesian law. The company sued under ISDS because they lost money. Okay, next. These are the guys these are the tribunals. So in all these treaties, you can choose 2 ways of what tribunal to use, yeah? One will be under the World Bank, another one is under the United Nations Commission on International Investment Law. So these 2, World Bank and the UN Commission on Investment Law, has tribunals. So if a country is a member of these 2 agreements setting up these tribunals, when you have a dispute, It is in the trade agreements. You can go and choose either one of these. And they are usually all men. And even the women here are, the gender doesn't matter. They're all international lawyers. Sometimes they are the judge. Sometimes they represent the government. Sometimes they represent the company. So they are really a pool of people with a lot of conflict of interest. And the rate is about $800 to $1,000 US an hour to hire lawyers to defend your case, okay? So this, and it's all secret. This is not like a court, all secret. And no appeal, okay? And most governments who get hauled up to these tribunals don't want to tell people because they feel that if other people know that they are being sued, it may send a bad signal to other investors that you're not protecting investors. So a lot of cases you might not even know because it's not public. Right? There's a very good book done by Transnational Institute in Europe called Profiting from Injustice. It gives you all these cases and all this conflict of interest. Okay, next. Okay, we can just skip. This is what I just told you just now. No limit to the compensation, right? You can just claim any amount you want and then hope to get it. Many cases also relate to workers' rights, more and more. A lot of cases are environment laws that you pass, you get into trouble, and also a lot of changes in your labor laws. Now, Malaysia's new government, I put here because we're in Malaysia, promises these few things which we are struggling to get. We're trying to get this implemented. It's a political commitment. If they do it, if we already have all these agreements, we could actually be sued by a company that now says, I have to pay more, and therefore I will have less profits, right? Okay, next. This is a case, a French company sued Egypt because a waste management company lodged a complaint against the Egyptian government for $110 million, partly because Egypt had chosen to introduce minimum wage for public sector workers. Okay, they lost the case, but the Egyptian company spent 6 years defending this case. They paid millions of dollars in arbitration fees to the lawyers and the legal costs. And the average cost of how much, you know how much it costs you to defend a case? $8 to $10 million. Sometimes can be $30 million, depending on how long the case can go on for years. Yeah. Now, when you lose a case, when a company loses a case, it doesn't mean the company pays the fees. The government still end up paying most of the fees, most of the time. But if a government loses, it has to pay its fees. So the whole thing is really unfair, okay? And there are no rules, this is private arbitration. Next. Another case. This is really terrible. Okay, this is an Italian and Luxembourg companies. They lodged a complaint, a whole bunch of them. They lodged a complaint against South Africa for $350 million. Why? Because after apartheid, the South African government had a Black Economic Empowerment Act, affirmative action, all right? Because of the apartheid inequalities. So they argued that, and this was supposed to, bring up its Black economic empowerment. The companies say this has affected our investment, and so it went on 2007, and then in 2010, the claim was dropped. Okay, the companies dropped the claim after the investors were granted new licenses with a much lower share divestment requirement. Basically, what this act said, because 100% of all these companies are owned by foreigners. So this act says you must have X% given to South African Black communities as shareholders. So they challenged this. So in the end, the South African government gave in. So they reduced the percentage to be given to local South Africans. This was a settlement. So you can imagine, this is a major policy of a country coming out of apartheid. Okay, next. Every month they paid millions of dollars for many years to the lawyers. Okay, last one. This one is Noble Ventures, a Romanian steel mill. They said that the Romanian government failed to protect the company from labor unrest. There was a strike. Labor rights, strike, okay? So the company said the government breached the obligation to ensure equitable treatment to the company. You didn't crack down on the strikers. The claim was ultimately dismissed because it's so ridiculous, yeah? But the arbitration panel did not say that labor unrest for grounds is not acceptable. They say in this case, the government did not breach. But they did not say, don't come back here daring to make these kind of claims. So this still could happen to any one of us, okay? Next one, quickly. Yeah.
Where was Noble Ventures from?
I can't remember this one. It's Europe, but I can't remember. Can look it up. Yeah. So high damages, always billions and billions that they claim. High legal costs. And sometimes governments can't afford it, so they drop and change the law or drop the law. Okay, next. UNCTAD actually has a lot of studies. These are all, I didn't make up all these figures. They're all studies, okay? And most of the cases are always decided in favor of the companies. Very few times, because of the way they interpret. So you could comply with all the agreement. You haven't done anything wrong, but because what you did reduced their profit, they didn't get fair and equitable treatment. So the interpretation of fair and equitable treatment is so distorted that even if you actually do everything right, they can still sue you, all right? Okay, private, all these people, what I just said. Next one. Other cases, well, for example, I will end with this one. The few I will give you in those. This is really terrible. This is under the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, between Canada and the United States. In the US, they actually banned this very toxic chemical. All right? This is one of the first cases. So Ethel is a US chemical company. The company operates in Canada, sued the Canadian government in 1997 because the Canadian government banned this chemical, very toxic additive in your petrol. So this is known to be a human neurotoxin. Okay, this is quite serious, to put it mildly. So the Canadian government banned this importation from the United States. The company threatened to sue, all right? And this chemical is not used in most countries outside Canada. It is banned in the United States itself. So they had a claim against Canada. They argued that this was indirect expropriation. By banning, you are taking from me. And this is not allowed under NAFTA. The Canadian government announced, after a lot of things, they didn't feel they had a strong enough case. Canadian government gave up. So they settled, because they sued them for hundreds of millions. So they came to a settlement, and they had to pay the firm $13 million in damages and legal fees. They paid the firm's legal fees and some compensation, $13 million. And they had to post an advertisement saying MMT was safe. And reverse the ban on MMT. Establish neurotoxin. Why would the government allow itself to be dragged to its knees like that? For me, that's actually the other question, okay? And then this is the same government that backed off on the Philip Morris, thing as well. Next one. Okay, Peru, you look for yourself. These are many cases. Look at the pollution. This is in Peru, okay? U.S. investor. Most of the cases are mining and oil and gas. And I haven't gone to the feminist lens. Women in every one of these cases are going to be the worst victims. In every one of these cases, okay? Because it's health, right? They settled and everything, they sued. Even if you win the case in your courts, this one, they actually took the case, you win the case in the courts, they can still go into a tribunal and claim their losses. Okay, next one. This is Chevron, very famous, Ecuador and Chevron. Texaco, 20-something years. Okay, go on. You can read all this yourself. I'll give this to you. All right. Last one before that. India. India had a case where the government, your 2G, this is old time, now we're talking about 5G, right? 2G, telco companies and all that. So one state government or whatever, politician was giving all these contracts, but there was corruption. So when the new government or somebody came along, they said this is corruption. So they took anti-corruption measures. They terminated all those contracts and said we do a proper tender. The investors all sued the Indian government. Okay? Nearly $20 billion. Because of this the way this was issued, the Indian government lost about 20 billion revenue. So when they came into the next group of people, decided to take action. The highest court in India, the Supreme Court, cancelled all those agreements because they were corruptly issued. The Indian government was sued for $14 billion because they say we lost so much money because you went and terminated our contract. Okay, next. This is why, so you pay the wrongdoer and the exploiter and the human rights violator. Okay, not the polluter. You don't punish the polluter, you pay them. Next. Countries are doing something. It is so awful. It's so awful. And of course, a lot of this has got a lot of protests on the ground, yeah? So what's happening? The current New Zealand government is against ISDS, all right? So they're trying to do a lot of side letters. So they did that in CPTPP. Australian Labour government, that is a party expected to win the next election, is not supporting ISDS, but they've already ratified the treaty. So I want to see what they're going to do. The Trump administration, in the renegotiation of the NAFTA, has removed most of ISDS. You won't see ISDS, this horrible ISDS, in the NAFTA. Okay? Because he doesn't want to be sued. American government doesn't want to be sued. Next. In 2015, European Commission said, very bad, all these ISDS private tribunals. But their solution is not so good either. They say, let's set up an investment court, a separate court for investment cases. So some of us are kind of objecting to that as well, because we say go to the national courts. Don't undermine the sovereignty of our national courts. Yeah? But then they say your courts are corrupt. But then when your courts do the right thing, they say, we don't like. Yeah. This investment court system is in the agreement between Europe and Canada and with Vietnam. Where are our Vietnam friends? Okay, you have a lot of things to do, I'm afraid, in Vietnam. Okay, so this investment court system may be a little bit better than the private arbitration, but not that much better, because it allows investors still to sue the state. Only you do it in a nicer way. Okay. This sort of new system of the Europeans is also being proposed in all these new agreements, which are now being negotiated with the US. Okay, but many countries. We feel, many critics, not just us in the World Network, but many of us say this is window dressing. This doesn't take away from the structural problem of ISDS. Okay, next. South Africa has withdrawn from all the bilateral investment treaties. Because many countries have signed many bilateral investment treaties. South Africa has walked away from all that and reviewing all their treaties. Indonesia in 2014 terminated 67 investment agreements. Because the Indonesian government said all these agreements were signed by all the previous governments. They're no good for Indonesia. We have a right, as the government today, to review them all. And now they're developing a new model investment agreement, okay? Germany is blocking. There's an EU-Canada FTA, and the Germans say we don't want ISDS, because German government got sued by a Scandinavian nuclear power company because Germany decided not to have nuclear power plants, okay? Next. In the US, all the state governments are now saying no to ISDS. A lot of literature, you can read a lot of literature, okay, to say no. This is my final thing. The Canadian foreign minister, after the revision of NAFTA a few months ago, which removes ISDS with the US in that agreement, she said it has cost Canadian taxpayers more than $300 million in penalties and legal fees. ISDS elevates the rights of corporations over those of sovereign governments. In removing it, we have strengthened our government's right to regulate in the public interest, to protect public health and the environment. So incomplete, right? So we have a long way to go. So first, you have to recapture policy space, because our governments gave them away, then they have no more protection for us, even if they want to give it to us. Right? So taxpayers, this is all taxpayers' money. Yeah? This is money they say we don't have enough for school, for social welfare, for helping women and everything else. Okay? This is money they say we don't have. But we put it aside for all this. Okay. So let's not give up, okay?